August 17th, 1943, above Schweinfurt, Nazi Germany. The thin air was torn apart by the deafening roar of hundreds of piston engines. At 27,000 feet, the American 8th Air Force bomber stream moved as a slow, vulnerable block of metal. 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109G fighters appeared from the sun, plunging down like grey raptors. In the cockpit of the leading Messerschmitt, Hauptfeldwebel Klaus Richter locked onto an escort fighter. He smirked. It was a Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, a massive, bulky machine that German pilots derisively called the Jug, or worse, the flying bathtub. Richter opened fire with his 20mm cannon, raking the P-47. The American pilot seemed unfazed, performing a steep, vertical dive. Richter scoffed. That heavy plane would shatter if it tried to pursue him. Richter had forgotten one simple truth. The P-47 was not designed to turn. It was designed to endure. He accelerated, following the dive. Within seconds, Richter's Bf-109 reached its structural limits. The airframe groaned, and he was forced to pull back the stick, but the P-47, weighing 17,000 pounds, kept plunging. It was accelerating past Richter. He realized he had made a fatal mistake. In less than a minute, the European battle sky had become the harshest possible laboratory, where American survival no longer relied on maneuverability, but on sheer raw power. The genesis of the P-47 Thunderbolt was born not from ambition, but from desperate necessity over the skies of Europe in late 1942. America's strategic bombing campaign, based on the deeply held but fundamentally flawed belief that the bomber will always get through, was quickly proving to be a bloody disaster. The plan was simple. Daylight precision bombing executed by massive formations of unescorted B-17 flying fortresses. The German Luftwaffe, initially dismissive, quickly developed devastating counter-tactics. They would stay safely outside the range of the bombers' 50 caliber machine guns, coordinating massed frontal or high-altitude attacks. Crucially, the German pilots utilized superior energy and the raw power of the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the later Messerschmitt Bf-109G variants. These interceptors, designed purely for short-range air defense, were fast, heavily armed, and relentless. They turned the American bomber stream into a shooting gallery. Black Tuesday, October 14, 1943, was a stark reckoning. During the second Schweinfurt raid, the USAAF lost 60 B-17s out of a force of 201, seen a catastrophic loss rate of over 20%. The crews called the deep penetration missions maximum effort. The losses became unsustainable. The core strategic concern of the Allies was now clear. The bombers could not survive without deep, reliable escort. The American fighter inventory at the time was wholly inadequate for this task. The P-38 Lightning, while capable, suffered from persistent engine cooling and maintenance issues, often limiting its operational range. The early versions of the P-51 Mustang were effective, but their engines were unreliable for deep escort missions, and they lacked the crucial extended fuel tanks. What the US needed was a machine with range, reliability, and most importantly, the ability to take a punch and return fire, a massive high-altitude brawler capable of confronting the most elite Luftwaffe squadrons deep inside Fortress Europe. This critical need drove the development from a light interceptor concept to a heavy, powerful fighter. The solution arrived in the form of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine that looked like a compromise but was, in fact, an engineering revolution. The Luftwaffe believed their short-range interceptors and robust air defenses guaranteed the safety of the Reich. They failed to account for a machine designed not for dogfighting elegance, but for unyielding endurance and destructive power. The mandate given to Republic Aviation and its chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, was unambiguous. Produce a fighter capable of high-altitude operations and long-range escort. The core of his design was the gargantuan Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp Engineer 2-row, 18-cylinder radial powerhouse generating over 2,000 horsepower. This engine was non-negotiable. It was the only way to lift the required weight and achieve the speeds demanded at bomber altitude. The sheer size of the engine dictated the rest of the airframe. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-47B variant, was an aviation titan. At nearly 17,000 pounds fully loaded, it was twice the weight of the nimble Supermarine Spitfire and almost 40% heavier than the Luftwaffe's primary interceptors. Its massive fuselage was necessary to house the powerful engine and the intricate turbo supercharger system required for high-altitude performance, earning it the derisive nicknames. This elaborate plumbing added weight, complexity, and length, but it was key to maintaining engine power above 25,000 feet, where the air was thin and enemy fighters were most dangerous. When the P-47 arrived in England in early 1943, it was met with widespread skepticism, even among its intended users. American pilots, trained on lighter, more maneuverable pre-war designs, found the P-47 clumsy at low speeds and sluggish in banking turns, the hallmark of classic dogfighting. They complained about the limited range of the initial variants. The psychological impact was twofold. American airmen saw a heavy, complex machine prone to initial teething problems. Meanwhile, the German pilots saw a target that looked slow and easy to outmaneuver. Luftwaffe pilots, masters of vertical combat and tight turns, believed the P-47 represented an unsophisticated, oversized brute. This widespread underestimation became the P-47's greatest initial tactical advantage. The Germans focused on its perceived lack of agility, ignoring the two critical design decisions that would redefine air combat: raw structural strength and the incorporation of 8 massive .50 caliber machine guns. The stage was now set for the P-47 to prove its detractors wrong, not in a graceful dance, but in a display of brute force and overwhelming firepower, changing the dynamic of air warfare from an elegant duel into a savage head-on collision. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a fighter plane built on a philosophy of overkill and absolute resilience. This structural integrity became its first and arguably most important angle of success. The sheer mass of the P-47 was its shield. Its heavy-gauge aluminum skin and massive steel primary structure allowed it to absorb punishment that would instantly disintegrate a lighter aircraft. Pilots returning from missions often counted hundreds of holes in their airframes. This was due in part to the massive engine, which was not only a power source but a ballistic buffer. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine was air-cooled. This layout meant that a single incoming cannon shell, which would instantly disable a liquid-cooled inline engine, often only damaged 1 or 2 cylinders of the R2800. The remaining cylinders could continue to provide enough power to nurse the battered P-47 home. This was a critical divergence in design philosophy. The German and British relied on speed and agility to avoid being hit. The Americans relied on mass and redundancy to survive being hit. Furthermore, the P-47 carried an immense amount of armament: 8 M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. When a P-47 pilot opened fire, they were directing approximately 6,000 rounds per minute towards the enemy. This sheer volume of fire compensated for the P-47's wider turning radius, turning it into a devastating platform that saturated the target area with lethal projectiles. Its primary task was not to perform graceful dances, but to destroy the enemy in one devastating pass. Another critical, yet often underestimated feature was the later introduction of the bubble canopy. Early P-47 versions used a razorback design, which severely limited rearward and upward visibility. The P-47D-25 variant changed this dramatically. The traditional fuselage structure behind the cockpit was eliminated and replaced with a clear, frameless perspex canopy. This simple change was revolutionary. It offered pilots 360-degree vision, drastically improving situational awareness. This enhanced visibility did more than just improve awareness. It massively boosted pilot confidence. Knowing they could scan the skies without blind spots allowed P-47 pilots to fly more aggressively and protect their vulnerable bombers with greater efficiency. The German pilots, still flying Bf-109s with crammed, restricted cockpits, found themselves facing an enemy who could now see their flanking maneuvers long before they were ready to attack. The massive frame, once an object of ridicule, was now a platform of overwhelming firepower and superior sightlines. This allowed the P-40 to fully exploit the single, incredible advantage that its bulky engine and high mass provided: the speed of its vertical assault. The P-47's immense weight. Initially, its biggest tactical liability in a traditional dogfight became the foundation of its most lethal combat technique. This shift in philosophy moved the P-47 away from the turning battles of the Great War and firmly into the era of energy fighting. The heavy mass of the Thunderbolt, coupled with its powerful supercharged engine, meant it possessed unrivaled kinetic energy at high altitude. While it was poor at sustained turns, its rate of acceleration in a dive was astronomical. P-47 pilots quickly developed and perfected the strategy known as boom and zoom. The technique was simple and devastatingly effective. The P-47 would gain a superior altitude advantage. The pilot would then execute a full-power, near-vertical dive. The enormous weight and streamlined aerodynamics allowed the aircraft to build speed rapidly, easily exceeding the maximum safe speeds of its German counterparts. The Bf-109 and FW-190, if they attempted to follow the dive, risked the structural failure of their wings. The pilot of the P-47 would boom, tear through the enemy formation at immense velocity, saturating the target with the continuous stream of 850 caliber machine guns.
After the pass, the pilot would zoom, using the high speed gained from the dive to immediately climb back to altitude, far above the remaining German fighters. They were masters of the hit and run, relying on speed disparity and overwhelming firepower to ensure total victory. Crucially, the P-47's robust structure meant it could withstand the stresses of transonic dives, where German planes often simply lost control and crashed. This diving superiority meant that a German pilot, once spotting a jug above them, had only two choices: flee horizontally or die in the vertical fight. The ultimate success of the P-47 was not just technical, it was human. The Thunderbolt became the mount of some of the most famous and highest scoring American aces in the European theatre. Pilots like Colonel Francis S. Gabreski, the US AAF's leading ace in Europe with 28 confirmed aerial victories, flew the P-47 exclusively. Another legendary figure, Robert S. Johnson, who scored 27 victories, often credited the P-47's ability to absorb punishment for his very survival. This widespread confidence among elite pilots was infectious. It transformed the P-47 from a derided flying bathtub into the beloved jug a term of powerful endearment, signifying its reliable, tough-as-nails character. Pilots knew that if they flew the P-47 according to the boom and zoom doctrine, the plane's raw strength and vertical speed guaranteed their ability to disengage safely, regardless of the odds. The German pilots, who had once scornfully dismissed the fat American fighter, were now forced to confront the terrifying reality. The P-47 was not fast in a turn, but it was absolutely unbeatable when it was diving to kill. The proving ground for the P-47's resilience and the decisive factor in the air war over Europe arrived in the form of the deep penetration escort missions of late 1943 and early 1944.
The American High Command gambled the fate of the bombing campaign on the P-47. November 29, 1943. This date marked a symbolic shift. The target was the industrial area around Bremen. The mission saw the P-47s carrying the newly standardized external drop tanks for the first time on a deep raid. These tanks were the key to unlocking the P-47's full potential, allowing the massive fighters to stay with the bombers for the entire round trip into German airspace and back. The German response was swift and brutal. Luftwaffe Jagdgeschwader were briefed to engage the American fighters aggressively. Oberleutnant Erich Schuler, flying the agile FTU 190A, encountered the P-47 escort near the border. Schuler, focused on his superior turning radius, tried the textbook maneuver, a tight, high G climbing turn. The P-47, flown by Major Joseph D. Boyd of the 56th Fighter Group, simply ignored the turning contest. Boyd deployed the perfected boom and zoom tactic, recognizing Schuler's attempt to lure him into a low-energy fight. Boyd instead initiated a 90-degree diving attack against a separate FW-190 element below. He fired a 2-second burst, destroying the FW-190. By the time Schuler could recover his energy, Boyd was already climbing steeply back towards the sun. This tactical change baffled the German pilots. Their training and machines were optimized for the turning dogfight, a style of combat the P-47 effectively rendered obsolete. The Americans refused to play by the old rules. They used the sky vertically, relying on energy conservation and high-speed passes. The German pilots, constrained by the structural limits of their own aircraft, found themselves unable to follow the P-47 into the deeper dive. Nor could they match its climb rate after the pass. The psychological break often came when the German pilots witnessed the P-47's absurd level of damage tolerance.
Numerous combat reports detail P-47s flying back to England with large sections of their wings missing, still managing to maintain speed and control. This resilience was critical because it allowed the P-47s to remain engaged with the enemy for longer periods, fulfilling their primary mission, keeping the German interceptors away from the bomber stream. The weight and complexity that had once invited mockery now delivered terror. The relentless pressure exerted by the P-47s began to grind down the German fighter force. The critical mass of the air war was shifting, not through a single aerial victory, but through the cumulative effect of the Thunderbolt's brutal, uncompromising design. The relentless pressure exerted by the P-47 reached its breaking point for the Luftwaffe in the spring of 1944. The American goal was no longer merely to protect the bombers, it was to annihilate the enemy's fighter force, to achieve absolute air superiority before the planned invasion of France.
The P-47, initially the awkward escort, became the primary instrument of that destruction. The final devastating chapter of the P-47's dominance came through the adoption of freelance or rambling missions, where fighter groups were given permission to roam freely across German territory at lower altitudes. This change in doctrine was revolutionary. The Thunderbolt pilots were now unleashed, hunting the enemy wherever they could find them. The German command was utterly unprepared for this new, brutal phase of air warfare. The P-47's transition to the ground attack role earned it a new, unofficial designation: the Jug. The P-47 was uniquely suited for this role due to its durability. Low-level ground attack is immensely dangerous, exposing the aircraft to small arms fire and anti-aircraft guns, flak. The P-47's robust radial engine, thick armor plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks allowed it to shrug off damage that would have crippled the sleek, liquid-cooled Mustang or Spitfire.
This ground supremacy culminated in the lead-up to D-Day. Operation Overlord required the Allies to possess total control of the air and the ground transport networks of France. In the weeks leading up to June 6, 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt squadrons systematically destroyed the French and Belgian rail systems, bridges, and German military convoys. They were equipped with not only their 850 caliber machine guns, but also rockets and bombs, turning them into flying artillery. The German logistical system was effectively paralysed. Any movement attempted in daylight was immediately subjected to the devastating Jug attacks. The realisation among the German leadership was chilling. The skies were lost. They could no longer reliably intercept bombers, and more importantly, they could not move their troops or supplies without certain destruction. This complete neutralisation of the German air and ground movement capabilities was the true turning point of the war in the West. When the Allied landing craft finally hit the beaches of Normandy, the invasion force enjoyed the invaluable umbrella of total air cover, largely secured by the sheer endurance and firepower of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 had transitioned from a clumsy, mocked design to the undisputed master of the European low-level battlefield. The P-47, the flying behemoth, had proven that speed and resilience in the vertical plane, coupled with overwhelming firepower, was the new currency of aerial victory, paving the way for a swift and costly reckoning for the German High Command. The impact of the P-47 Thunderbolt's dominance was quantifiable and devastating. By the end of the war, the Thunderbolt had flown over 546,000 combat sorties across all theatres, destroying 3,752 enemy aircraft in aerial combat. More importantly, it had dropped 132,000 tons of bombs and fired over 60 million rockets and rounds of ammunition in its ground attack role. The psychological toll on the Luftwaffe was perhaps even more crippling than the physical losses. The German fighter pilots were now facing an opponent they could neither outrun at altitude nor outfight in the vertical. German combat reports from the spring of 1944 increasingly show a sense of demoralization. Pilots were instructed to avoid engaging the P-47 in a prolonged fight, a directive that was impossible to follow when the P-47's primary mission was to seek and destroy. General Adolf Galland, one of the most respected German aces and commander of the fighter arm, later remarked that the relentless pressure from the Allied fighter screens effectively neutralized the German fighter arm to the point of being insignificant, a profound admission of failure. The strategic consequence was a catastrophic drain on experienced German pilots. The P-47's ability to destroy aircraft quickly and survive long enough to fight another day meant the loss ratio skewed heavily in favor of the Americans. The replacement pilots the Germans brought in were poorly trained and were quickly overwhelmed by the overwhelming numbers and combat expertise of the P-47 squadrons. This pilot deficit meant that, even when new German interceptors like the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter arrived, they could not be effectively utilised. The airfields they operated from were under constant threat of strafing by the P-47s. The most enduring consequence lay beneath the aircraft itself. In its primary role as a ground attack platform, the P-47 became known as the tank buster. Its heavy armament, particularly when using the highly effective high-velocity rockets, could tear through the armour of German tanks and transport. The very existence of the P-47 overhead ensured that no significant German formation could move in daylight within the Western Theatre. The Atlantic Wall was finally rendered irrelevant, not by the breach on D-Day, but by the slow, grinding destruction of the German infrastructure that would have reinforced it. The physical battlefield on the ground was now dictated by the American aerial giant. The P-47 Thunderbolt left an enduring legacy that extended far beyond the immediate conclusion of hostilities in Europe. Its success cemented a fundamental shift in Allied aerial doctrine. The P-47 demonstrated conclusively that kinetic energy and structural resilience could decisively overcome the traditional advantages of low-speed agility and lightweight design. Strategically, the Thunderbolt's performance validated the American industrial philosophy of prioritizing mass production and rugged reliability over niche technological brilliance. The P-47, built around the reliable R2800 radial engine, possessed exceptional operational readiness rates, meaning more aircraft were available to fly missions every day, a factor as crucial as any technical specification. The P-47 also directly influenced the post-war evolution of jet fighters. Its extensive testing in the transonic regime during high-speed dives provided invaluable data on the effects of air compressibility, which was foundational knowledge for engineers designing the first generation of supersonic aircraft. The success of the P-47 in neutralizing German armor and logistics created the template for specialized ground attack aircraft, a doctrine that remains central to modern warfare. Even with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in large numbers, the P-47 maintained its specialized role. While the Mustang became the supreme high-altitude air-to-air duelist, the P-47 remained the favored choice for low-level, dirty work, the relentless strafing and rocketing of German targets that physically ground the Wehrmacht to a halt. The final count revealed that the American effort produced over 15,600 P-47s, making it the most mass-produced American fighter in history. Its widespread distribution across multiple air forces and theaters cemented its status as one of the most consequential single-engine fighters of the war. The pilot of the P-47, who once heard the sneering German pilots mock his flying bathtub, had the final word. The machine built for survival, not style, ultimately dictated the terms of victory. The P-47, initially the underdog, proved that in the crucible of war, resilience and destructive power were the true measures of engineering superiority. It left an indelible mark on military aviation. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt offers a profound philosophical lesson about the nature of warfare and innovation. It stands as a testament to the principle that brute strength and unwavering reliability can often triumph over subtle elegance and fragile complexity. The German pilots mocked the P-47's heavy, inelegant frame, viewing it as a manifestation of unsophisticated American mass production. They focused on the traditional criteria of the dogfight. But war is a brutal equation of energy, damage tolerance, and logistics. The Thunderbolt redefined the terms of that equation. It was designed not to be a beautiful dancer, but an unyielding weapon of survival. Its success underscores the critical role of resilience, both mechanical and psychological. The P-47 brought its pilots home, often riddled with holes and barely operational, fostering an unparalleled degree of confidence and aggressive spirit. This faith allowed American pilots to press attacks further and deeper, grinding down the German Luftwaffe not through superior maneuverability, but through sheer, overwhelming staying power. The ultimate reflection is this. The P-47 Thunderbolt revealed that in the 20th century's air war, The ability to absorb the enemy's best punch and keep fighting was the true measure of a combat aircraft. The flying bathtub became the ultimate guarantor of air superiority, ensuring that the critical battles on the ground, from Normandy to the Rhine, were fought and won under an American sky. The big, powerful, and often mocked P-47 proved that sometimes the most effective path to victory is not grace, but uncompromising force.